Good evening and welcome to Strand Group 23. My name is Michelle Pemmon and I'm one of the Contemporary British History PhD students here at King's who contributes to the running of the Strand Group. My PhD focuses on Sir Michael Barber and the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit from 2001 to 2005. I also co-teach with Dr. John Davis a number 10 partnered master's course on number 10 and the history of the Prime Minister since 1945. The Strand Group seeks to bring together government, business and academia through events, teaching and research. And as such, we are here this evening to hear Ed Balls and Peter Sands present their new Harvard research paper on how to make Brexit work for British businesses. They are joined by Gisela Stuart, former MP for Birmingham Edgbaston and co-chair of Vote Leave, and Stephanie Flanders, Chief Market Strategist for the UK and Europe at JP Morgan Asset Management. Before I hand over to Dr. John Davis, Director of the Strand Group, I'd like to say a big thank you to our sponsors, DXC Technology and the Department of Political Economy here at King's, who make this evening possible. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome. When this was planned, there was no election. I got a phone call from Ed. I was sitting with Lord Macpherson, actually, and Professor Jeremy Jennings. Yes, there he is, and Bill Keegan. Ed phoned and said that would we like to do this? Within seconds, I went, of course we would. And then when the election was called, Ed spoke to the various members of the panel and said, shall we? The decision was taken to go ahead just a couple of days after what was confidently expected to be a huge Tory victory. It would have been, and we took the decision, it would have been very important to be doing that event a few days after a huge Tory victory, a mandate for what many describe as a very hard Brexit. But I think you'll agree with me regarding the weekend, the result, the bloodletting, the way that so many people from right across the spectrum, but most importantly within the Conservative Party, have reared their heads and are continuing to do so, to talk about how they need how the country really could do with a bit more thinking, a bit more flexibility, a bit more sophistication over the coming Brexit negotiations. And so I think, as we see from this morning and the carpet coverage of this particular report on the radio, in the printed press, that this is the issue of the moment. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our visiting professor, Ed Balls. Ed.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Just to explain how we're going to do this, I'm going to just say a couple of words of introduction. Peter's going to talk through the report. I'm then going to say a little bit at the end about the politics, and then we're going to hand over to get some comments from Gisela and from Stephanie. And we're really grateful for the two of them coming along and being part of the discussion today. And then we'll open it up to a discussion with all of you. As John said, I should just say, first of all, thank you to the Strand Group, to John Davis, to Professor Jennings, to the principal and everybody at King's who've helped to arrange tonight, and also to the Mustafa Rahmani Centre in Harvard who funded the work, and to Nyasha Weinberg and Sebastian Leaf who've done a lot of the work on this since the end of last year. They're both here, and also here are a number of the companies who were interviewed for this report. As John said, when we set out to write this report, we weren't expecting there to be a general election. So on our very nicely designed cover for this report, which is a Scrabble board, we had to add on election and hung at the last minute alongside business, Brexit and EU to deal with these changing events. I think the judgment we had, though, was that at some point this year, the debate about how we do Brexit was going to take off. And I think at the beginning of the election campaign, we thought that was likely to be the Monday after the general election, with a reshuffle out of the way and 10 days to go until the negotiations. And clearly that is even more so the case with the great uncertainty in our politics. But going back to where we started this work, I think at the end of last year, like many of you, we observed the debate, or the lack of debate, about what Brexit actually means after the general election, Clearly in a referendum campaign, a number of arguments are used, and there was lots of arguments about potential short-term economic impact. There are arguments about National Health Service funding and Turkish accession to the European Union. There wasn't a huge amount of discussion about the concrete detailed issues which are going to affect this negotiation, the single market, yes or no, customs union, yes or no. And we were discussing in the autumn how we could try to contribute to that debate. And Peter Sands came up with a very, very smart idea that rather than this being done through our voices or the voices of academics or researchers or former business leaders, former politicians, we should go out and talk to business and companies themselves and get their view when we talked in detail with them about the issues which they would face in the run-up to and then after the end of the Article 52-year period and whatever transitional arrangement and final deal came after that. We also decided, though, Peter decided, that we shouldn't do this through multinational companies who have a lot of voice and a lot of flexibility. We should go to small and medium-sized companies, quite big employers, but companies which are probably more tied to doing business in and exporting from the United Kingdom. We haven't tried to be properly statistically representative, but we tried to get a broad group of businesses across manufacturing and services, different sectors, different parts of the country, Scotland, Northern Ireland, as well as England, and to try and get a sort of randomised mix of businesses. We went to a range of members of Parliament, Labour and Conservative, Liberal Democrat and SNP, MPs who voted for Remain, MPs who campaigned for Leave, and asked them to recommend to us businesses in their constituency which were exporting businesses of varied types and who we could talk to talk through these issues. And that's what's happened over the last 6 months, in particular led by Nasha and Seb, doing, I think, interviews with over 30 businesses, and then in addition, another 20 plus trade associations. I think we concluded, when you look at some of the sectoral issues that we look at in the paper, the breadth of experience that the trade associations bring was very important as well. So this paper is a summary of 6 months' work of over 50 lengthy interviews, plus wider research and discussion. It was not intended to be Brexit yes or no. It was intended to be what kind of Brexit will work for business, jobs, growth in the United Kingdom, to try and tease out some of the things which will be vital in the coming weeks and months as the negotiation sets off. And over to Peter to kind of go through the details of the report.
Okay. I might stand here just so I can put my notes somewhere, but there are no slides. You don't have to look at anything. So what did the businesses we talked to tell us? Well, the first thing I would say is it's not like they all agreed with each other. We had lots of diverse views expressed. But that said, some very strong themes came through from businesses in all different parts of the country and from different sectors. And we arranged those findings around 4 sort of broad groups. One was about trade, a second, regulation, a third, a whole bundle of sector-specific issues, and then finally, implementation issues. Trade. It comes through incredibly strongly when you talk to businesses that what they want is to be able to trade with the minimum of impediments possible. And so it should be no surprise that almost all the businesses we talked to were keen on staying in the single market and customs union, and if they couldn't get that as an outcome, they wanted a free trade agreement, and they were not at all enthusiastic about the no deal scenario. Indeed, many of them saw that as a really very damaging outcome. Companies recognize that one of the advantages, potential advantages of Brexit is that if you leave the customs union, you can negotiate your own trade deals, which might be better suited to the UK's strengths or tap new markets. But actually, they were very skeptical about the ability of such new trade deals to offset any potential loss from trade with the EU. And the maths kind of stacks up here. Basically, 61% of the UK's current exports go to either the EU or to EFTA or to countries with which the UK already has an FTA through the EU. Of the balance of 39%, half of it's the US, and the rest of the world is basically just 20%. So you have to get very significant increases in growth of exports to the other parts of the world if you're going to compensate for any type of reduction in the EU or where the EU has already arranged FTAs. There was some recognition of positives in just the fact that Brexit was forcing the government to think harder about impediments to trade. These might not be things like FTAs, but they could be mutual recognition of qualifications for services, helping smaller businesses understand foreign markets and so on, various ways in which trade could be supported. Businesses recognized that much of these impediments could have been dealt with without leaving the EU, but the fact that they appeared to be getting greater focus was welcomed. But the overriding message on trade was, please can we stay in the single market and customs union, and if we can't get that, we want an FTA. On regulation, actually we were a little surprised, because if you follow the political and media commentary, you would think that businesses were just champing at the bit to escape European regulation. That is not what we heard. What we heard is actually that they fear that they will end up with more regulation. And the logic is very simple. Many of them are going to have to comply with European regulation anyway, because a significant part of their business still interacts with Europe, either directly or because they are a supplier to exporters. And now they face the prospect that the UK will be having its own regulation, and over time it's almost inevitable that it'll be different regulation, and that just generates cost. Many of them also, to our surprise, were actually quite complimentary about the regulations in their sector. Of course, they were all aware of particular examples they could cite of excessive or strange bits of regulation. They didn't think these were unique to the European Union, and actually a number said the painful process of making regulatory rules in Europe with all 28 states involved actually tended to weed out some of the more sort of excessive sides of it. And in fact, in many areas, the UK has been very influential, and indeed the country pushing the gold standard, the highest standard. This led many firms to be quite concerned about both the prospect of increased regulation, but also what degree of future engagement the UK would have, or influence the UK would have on European regulation, which inevitably will continue to have a significant influence on these companies. And this, a theme that came out that, again, I for one had not anticipated being so strong, is the importance of the 35 sector or topic-specific European regulatory agencies, things like the European Banking Authority, the European Medicines Agency, EASA in aviation. There's a whole slew of these specialist agencies. And a lot of companies talked about the importance of staying engaged, and also the fact that these were pools of expertise. And thirdly, a degree of puzzlement as to how the UK was actually going to create equivalent agencies in a very, very short time frame. A third big bucket of findings we had was a set of sector-specific issues. Now, we didn't try, within the confines of this research, to try and solve the problems of agriculture or the automotive industry or the pharma industry or so on. But what we were struck by were 5 broad themes that were affecting a number of different sectors. First, you had sectors that are highly dependent on very, very integrated supply chains. The most obvious example is the car industry, but you would also take the aviation, the aerospace, and the chemical sectors, where you often get products going backwards and forwards several times across borders within the EU. Over the last decades, they've worked extremely hard to build these pan-European supply chains. The point there is that very small incremental frictional costs can add up very significantly. And so having customs controls can lead to costs and delays even if you have a free trade agreement. Second, you have businesses that are dependent on harmonized regulation, and they were typically fearing additional costs. Most obvious examples would be financial services firms that depend on passporting, or pharmaceutical firms that get a single license for their product through the EMA, typically at the moment, and face the prospect of potentially having to get one for the UK and one for the rest of Europe. Third category are sectors dependent on EU protection and subsidies. Agriculture and fishing are two big examples, and they face the prospect of really significant uncertainty. Now, this may be a catalyst for beneficial thinking about different ways of having policy towards these sectors, but it will clearly be very different, and there are some big political trade-offs there to be made. Fourth, you have sectors heavily reliant on direct EU funding. This includes universities, a lot of scientific research, the venture capital world, the tech industry, and also you have regional development funds. There has been guarantees, at least for a temporary nature from the government as to continued funding, but what is the longer term prospect there? And then finally, one thing we found many companies across many sectors talking about is the importance of continued access to EU labour, either highly skilled labour in particular sectors like financial services, technology or research, or seasonal labour in other sectors like agriculture and hospitality. And firms were acknowledging the political imperatives about controlling immigration more, but simultaneously saying, we need this access and we need an immigration system that actually works. Our last category of findings was what we talked about as being implementation priorities, and these fell into two categories. First, there was the management of the transition itself. How do we get from where we are today to leaving the EU? And companies are basically highly skeptical that the 2-year timeframe works at all. And they're also concerned that the rush to resolve a whole set of issues will result in both poor outcomes and inadequate consultation. And particularly if you're a smaller firm, you're worried about, is your voice going to be heard? And they're also concerned that there's a lack of realism in policymakers' minds about how long it will take businesses to actually be able to adapt their business models to the new realities. So it's one thing to be told if Brexit happens on 31st of March 2019, you don't want to know that you've got to change all your supplier arrangements 3 weeks before, because these things take time if you're going to avoid any cliff edge effects. And then you have some implementation considerations which are around the new policies and processes that have to be put in place. And two came out again and again. One is that customs controls and procedures are going to have to be massively upgraded if we're not to have significant incremental costs affecting particularly those businesses with highly integrated supply chains. And secondly, we need an immigration system that works and is able to deal with the needs of different sectors for accessing either skilled talent from the EU or seasonal labour. Another final theme that came up was the need to think about all of this not in a kind of steady state context, but recognizing the fact that this is just one of the things happening to the business environment, of which the other most dramatic things are the pace of technology change and continuing shifts in globalization. And so the way we implement Brexit has to enable firms to take advantage of and adapt to those trends simultaneously. So if those were the findings, what were the conclusions? I'll do this very quickly. Broadly speaking, if you were to take those as your inputs, you would say negotiating a trade deal that keeps us close to the single market and customs union as possible is what firms want. Secondly, in thinking about trade outside the EU, the thing that really matters is sustaining and building on the relationships with the major trading partners. It might be interesting to look at smaller countries in Africa and Asia, but frankly, they won't make a difference. It's the big trading relationships that matter. Third, we need to devise arrangements to ensure that we don't have unwarranted regulatory divergence and duplication, and that we have some continued influence on these key EU regulatory agencies, particularly for those industries where there's a natural cross-border element. Fourth, we need an immigration framework that enables British business to access skilled and seasonal EU labour. We need upgraded customs controls and procedures. And we need a process that enables us to deal with some of these big sectoral issues, particularly in areas like agriculture, where there are tough decisions to be made, balancing the interests of British consumers, who could potentially get cheaper food, the farming community and rural community, environmental considerations, and so on. And then finally, this point of let's not be making these decisions in a way that just takes business as it is today, but is keeping an eye on the world of scientific innovation, technological change, and so on. So that, in a nutshell, is what we found. Thank you.
This is going to go slightly, in fact largely beyond what's in the paper, because the paper was written for a very different political context than the one which we now face ourselves in. It was written, first of all, not expecting a general election, and then, as the poll suggested, expecting a general election which threw up a Conservative majority afterwards, and therefore the issue would be, could we put issues on the table for a Theresa May-led negotiation over the coming months and couple of years with our EU partners. Now, clearly, that is all now substantially in doubt because of events in the last few days. And I thought, in order to sort of tee up the discussants and the rest of the discussion, it was worth speculating a little bit about the politics as well and how I think this is going to work out. And this is very much my speculation, because we're very early into this and we don't know how things are going to work out, but this is how it seems to me. First of all, in my discussions, and many of you will have these discussions with people in government, outside of government, who know government very well, people were never quite sure what the truth was about the Theresa May negotiating strategy. It was either brilliantly subtle, controlled, and sort of sophisticated, and was going to end up with a credible cliff edge threat which would leave a good outcome at the end, or it was a series of rather head-banging lines to take without huge underlying substance. And after that general election campaign, well, I think the best thing to say is we will never know which it was, but the one thing you can absolutely say is that there is no mandate from that general election for a Prime Minister May saying, trust me, Brexit is Brexit, and I will deliver the best deal for Britain, because but I'd be very surprised if any politician ever says Brexit means Brexit again over the next couple of years. The first thing you'd have to say is if Brexit is Brexit meant a very hard Brexit, there was clearly no mandate for that out of this general election. You only have to look at what's happened in constituencies across the south, across London, but in a number of southern constituencies as well, to see that the Conservative Party will not be thinking there's a mandate from this general election for a hard Brexit. I think the no deal is better than a bad deal is substantially put into question by the general election result. On the other hand, there is also clearly also no mandate for reversing the referendum or for Remain out of this general election as well. And anybody who thinks that's what the poll is telling them, I think is also making quite a big mistake. The striking thing, in addition to what we saw in Kensington, Battersea, across the south, was the fact that the UKIP vote, particularly in the cities, but also in suburban areas and towns across the north of England, the east and the West Midlands, split much more evenly between Conservative and Labour than people expected. I think that was a judgment on a number of policies in the manifesto of the Conservative Party and Theresa May's leadership, but to think that that was UKIP voters reconsidering their view of last year's referendum result, I think would also be quite foolish. Which leads you to the third point, which is in the last couple of days, both main parties have been quite keen to stick to the lines on which they fought the general election. While David Davis was talking about needing to prune the manifesto today on the radio, I don't think he was talking about pruning around European policy. If you listen to John McDonnell, Barry Gardiner, there is clearly not a retreat from the Labour position, which is that we accept the result of the referendum and that staying in the single market is either, in John McDonnell's view, not going to happen or very difficult indeed in the Barry Gardiner world. And I think in the short term, it's unlikely we'll see a big reopening of that, that fundamental principled set of arguments. And that's, I think, why our paper is still very relevant, because it's about the how and the nuts and bolts rather than the principled argument of a year ago. On the other hand, this is clearly not going to continue to be business as usual. One, because of the substantial weakening of the mandate of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. Secondly, because there is no majority now in Parliament for a hard Brexit. And thirdly, because the government is going to rely upon the DUP for its continuation, for continuing to govern. And we know that the one thing the DUP can't deal with is no deal or a hard Brexit. So that certainly changes the landscape. I think it's important to remember why Theresa May called this election. And it's, I think it's simplistic to think she just thought it would be easier for her to have a large majority, although she clearly thought it would be easier to have a large majority and life would be much, much harder with no majority at all. But it was also because I think the more Whitehall and the government looked at the detail of the negotiation, the way things were going to go, and you see some of this reflected in our paper. One, it was clear that getting a deal done within 2 years was going to be impossible, certainly an exit deal, and therefore Britain's continuing relationship with the European Union would be a factor after 2019. Secondly, that there is no sensible deal, and I think David Davis was probably the first Conservative minister to say this. There's no sensible deal which doesn't involve an ongoing financial contribution from Britain to the European Union. And thirdly, any transitional arrangement is likely to be very close to, if not identical, to the current single market, because it will be too difficult to negotiate anything other than that in the time frame available. And the one thing that Theresa May didn't want to do is have to deal with those three very, very difficult, thorny issues in the run-up to a 2019 general election. So what she was really doing was buying some time to try and resolve those issues over a longer period of time. It's not clear that she succeeded in buying time. She's certainly not got a majority, but none of those issues go away. They're still very much live issues for the government and on the table. Seems to me there's three things which could happen. You could have the government trying for an extended period to muddle through and continue to lead the negotiations as they are saying they're going to do at this stage. That is incredibly hard to pull off, because I think the chief negotiator has had such a massive loss of credibility, because the other side who they're negotiating with will know that Parliament is absolutely not a foregone conclusion when it comes to taking any agreement back to Parliament. That the cliff edge threat is no longer a credible threat in the way it might have been if you'd had a Conservative majority of a sizable scale with no election expected until 2022. So this is just a very, very weakened position for the government to be negotiating. It seems to me that you can muddle through for a while, but not for the full 2 years. The second thing could be some kind of cross-party arrangement. I think that will prove to be neither in the interests of neither of the main parties, although there'll be voices on both sides, including the highly respected Yvette Cooper, who will make the argument that it would be a good idea. And I think the reason why it's unlikely to happen is twofold, because from the government's point of view, it's too much of an admission of weakness, too much of an acceptance that they can't actually lead in these circumstances. There will be people, as George Osborne is claiming today in the Standard, who will reach out to Labour MPs, but they won't be the most senior leadership in the cabinet. He won't be the Prime Minister doing that. But secondly, I think Jeremy Corbyn will be extremely wary of getting into any such discussion as well. The one thing that he succeeded in doing in this general election was winning, because Theresa May moved from being the outsider, not the Cameron Osborne politician, to being an absolute insider during the election campaign in a politics in which insiders are quite unpopular. Jeremy Corbyn has maintained his position as the outsider campaigner, and the one thing he won't want to do is end up in a sort of halfway house of being half in and half out, involved in some kind of cross-party negotiation. It doesn't mean that the select committees won't do important jobs and Hilary Benn. It doesn't mean that there won't be more discussion and communication, but anything which actually looks like a sharing of risk, I'll be very surprised if either side want to do that. And therefore, the conclusion is that we will end up with a general election during the negotiation and probably relatively early in the general election. And the question will be whether it's possible for that general election to give a governing party a mandate. Because both parties are coalitions, both parties are trying to manage voters and supporters who cross the Remain-Leave divide. But the one thing you can definitely say is there will be more of a debate in the next general election about Brexit and the kind of issues in our paper than there was last time. I think in the end, the issue is going to come down to leadership, which is not simply saying, will we have a change of Prime Minister, but what kind of optics, what kind of process evolves probably post a general election in the relationship between Britain and our European partners as we pursue this negotiation. And therefore it will depend as much upon the politics of France and Germany and their relationship to the Commission and to Britain as it will to British politics here. I've always figured that the right way to think about the choice we faced was about how you choose to go about divorcing. And you can separate and divorce in two different ways. You can either start from an amicable conversation, talking about how we make sure the children's best interests are supported, trying to make sure that we can find a way to work out a post-divorce arrangement. Every now and then people actually start that kind of separation and realise along the way they actually don't want a divorce at all and they actually can resolve their issues. But that's probably quite an unusual thing to happen, but it's not impossible. If, on the other hand, you bring in the lawyers and start a financial row from the beginning, you can say any chance of a good outcome for both sides is gone. Everybody will lose. It will cost a lot of money. And the children, which in this case is probably jobs and growth, are absolutely casualties along the way. I think after the last 6 months, it seemed to me pretty likely we were on the latter course. But something has happened, which is very unusual, and that plus a general election could shock us back into the former. It could, and that will depend upon leadership on both sides. I think the one conclusion that I draw from European politics, watching it in the last 20 years of my life, is that the one thing you should never do is leave the room. David Cameron's most catastrophic decision was to walk out of the Six-Pack Summit in Brussels 5 years ago. Once you walk out, it's really hard to get back in again. Theresa May can't get back in the room. It's very hard for her to negotiate from the outside anything other than a difficult, painful and expensive deal for both sides. However, what's happened in France, what could happen in Germany, what could happen in Britain, there is a chance of political leaders on both sides getting back in the room. To do that, they'll have to make sure a number of senior people from the Commission are absolutely not in the room. We'll see whether that happens. That seems to be the political backdrop to the debate about the important issues in our paper.
Thank you. Thanks.
Gisela.
Thank you very much. As I was listening to Ed, I suddenly thought, when we talk about divorce, there's a third option, which is you both go off, you marry someone else, and you're infinitely happier than you were before. I and my first husband did that. So, let's just get out of this gloom period, because I think we're still too much into this is just all terribly awful, and the British people have just made a terrible mistake. Now, a couple of things. I think it's really helpful that you've done this, because I think a number of solutions of how we move forward will come from industry, and they will tell us how the best implementation is. And industry is used to dealing with a whole lot of things. Some of them have got the word European in it and are actually creatures of the European Union. And others have just got the word Europe in it because it's the framework within which they actually do their rules and regulations. But I want to start with a little bit of history, because there virtually is nothing in the report I would find I could disagree with. The only thing which I think I would add is, where do we go from here? How do we look ahead? And this may be terribly heretical to say this in this context of academic institutions. When it comes to the future, you're not very good at predicting it. Whether you want to read Paul Ormerod's Why Most Things Fail, or whether you go back to your basic fundamentals of Austrian economics, this kind of, when you open things and you unleash things, and I just want to tell an episode which is so far back that I don't think anybody in the room can remember it, but it nevertheless, in terms of economics, is a very important episode. And that is about the only time you had a practical comparison between controlled economies and social market economies. And in 1948, Germany is divided into 4 zones: the Russian, the French, the German, and the British. And Ludwig Erhard decides overnight to lift rationing, which all the Social Democrats thought was the best way of allocating resources, was rationing, introduces the Deutschmark, is told by General Clay. General tells Erhard, all my advisors tell me you're wrong. Erhard says, it's fine, so do mine. And nevertheless, they go ahead, and what you have is goods appearing on the shelves literally overnight. The British and the American zone, you literally see the change of liberation. The French 6 months later have to follow suit. And of course, the Russians never did. That became East Germany. The point of this example is that after 40 years of having a relationship, where I think we probably have been quite stifled in thinking for ourselves, we are now moving a period where we have to think again for ourselves. And that's uncomfortable, because the unknown and the uncertain is always threatening. And now is the question of, how do you take that opportunity? Now, I see various people in the room. There's John Mills, who I'm sure will come in and tell me more about the economics, and there's Kishore Faulkner, who will, I hope, come in because I want to talk about regulation and how we can be rule makers. But I just want to come back to a couple of fundamentals. This general election has been the most extraordinary mess I've ever seen in my life, but we have it. However, just before anybody sort of starts saying this is for or against soft or hard Brexit, I want to make 2 observations. I've never understood those terms. The referendum, essentially the key message was we wanted to take final control over laws, borders and trade, and we wanted to stop the automaticity of payments into the EU. That's what all sides have agreed on, and the 2 major parties who have got more than 80% of the vote both had in their manifesto that that's what they're going to implement. So let's just flow our imagination, because what also is happening is there's still a prevailing attitude that at the moment you show how clever you are by telling me how even more complicated this whole process is going to be than you ever thought of it. And I want to challenge everybody here and say, show me how clever you are by telling me it can be done, and actually it's as simple as uncomplicated as you want it to be. Second observation is we're still assuming that it's only the United Kingdom that is in a state of flux. During the referendum debate, I had my youngest son staying with me who worked in the city, and I'm actually the kind of politician who gets up in the morning and says, am I sure I'm right? And every time I would ask this question, Alistair would say to me, Mother, never underestimate the Italian bank's ability to do something to prove you're fundamentally right. So, Productivity has not been resolved. The banking crisis in the EU has not been resolved. The euro is not yet a functioning proper currency unless there are changes happening. So my message is threefold. One is we are moving into this as, I would suggest, the greatest opportunity of a generation since the Second World War to rewrite the rules of how it relates to the rest of the world, and it will not do it in the wake of warfare. It will do it in the wake of peaceful development. Because what, from beginning with 2008, and the rest has shown me, is the post-World War II institutions have not been able to deal with the global flows of goods, capitals, and people. And that was the major reason why I ended up campaigning for leave. It was because there was no recognition that the Eurozone needs to deeper integrate and there has to be a different relationship. The second thing is for the United Kingdom. We have for too long, and I won't bore you with the stats, but just if you go through our failure to actually deal with the productivity gap, our failure to deal with training. We have increased university participation, but we have not dealt with illiteracy, we have not dealt with a whole lot of other problems, but companies have been for too long been able to get their way out of importing trained, skilled labour from somewhere else, which quite frankly has meant we have not dealt with our problems at home and we've impoverished the countries where they come from. Just turn on the BBC today, quite extraordinary. Latest report, isn't it terrible that EU nurses are no longer applying for jobs? 1,400 have now gone down to 400. Now, I didn't get a chance to fully check the figures, but as I understand it, the NHS employs something like over 300,000 nurses. So either there's something really wrong if you're now telling me that a drop in maximum 800 applications from the EU will now suddenly throw the EU into crisis, or if we need more nurses, why did we cut training places? Now, I know people who say we could have done that inside the EU or outside the EU, but we didn't do it because there were easy options. Now, where do we go from here? We've got a democratic mandate to do a job. If Parliament now goes round and says, oh, it's so difficult, it's a hung Parliament, if I were Joe Public as a voter, I would go and say, what do you think I'm paying you guys for? You know, there was a clear outcome, there was a mandate, there was a manifesto. Now, as far as business is concerned, divide three things. One is go and say there's a massive opportunity because trade, which is within the UK, therefore will not be bound by regulations. But the second big one, and I hope Kishwa will come in at some stage on this one, if you go back and say what has the United Kingdom been amazingly good at, other than actually being able to speak to the world in a way which people who want to be protective haven't. There have been rule makers where the rules are enabling rules. They're not rules which become barriers to entry. That's been the thing which the EU has been very good at, thank you very much. And I think if we want to say, how is innovation? Innovation, look at the immigration policy, which is not based on geography, but actually on the ability of skill. Universities keep telling me, oh, we must have free movement of labour because we want the brightest and the best. Okay, if we only have the brightest of the best and a free movement of 500 million population, and the global population is in 7 billion, can you please tell me why we can easily ignore the 6.5 billion? No. So Parliament needs to say, have a proper immigration policy, which is based not on geography, but skills and need. We need to say, making rules which are enablers is our great opportunity. And I finish on this final observation, is if only we realized, and I'm old enough to actually say this to you, if only we realized that this is the most extraordinary opportunity to overcome a structure which has been brilliant for several decades. It has outlived its usefulness, and we can shape the future if only we want to face up to it.
Well, thank you very much. We're probably going to sort of veer in different areas because as Ed and Peter have said, we've got a different setting for this event than we maybe originally planned. Look, you know, I'm sitting in JP Morgan Asset Management, but I also obviously had my previous incarnation as an economics journalist, and I'm still an economist underneath. So let me say a little bit about sort of short-term city-type view, very very briefly just on what's happened in the last few days, and then have a bit more of a sort of broader few points about that relate more to the paper and to some of the issues that Gisela mentioned. You know, I think that the considered conclusion of most serious commentators in the financial markets, certainly by now, but also by the end of the day on Friday, is that we are all complete idiots in this country, and we clearly can't remotely get our act together on anything and shouldn't expect to be taken seriously on anything for quite a while. Something I've found hard to deny in talking to my US colleagues. Of course, people have seen the possibility of a softer form of Brexit, whatever shape that might take in this, but they've also seen the possibility of a complete almighty mess over that with that 2-year ticking time frame for negotiations. So the fundamentals, I think, as the great phrase, the fundamentals have not really changed from the perspective of many investors, and I guess the bad news is the fundamentals were not looking that great to begin with from that same standpoint. When it comes to thinking about, and Peter mentioned this, thinking about timing issues, I think it is possibly worth dividing the financial sector, or at least bits of the financial sector, like big banks, from other parts of the business community in terms of the kind of preparations they have to do and how much you can do to help them in those preparations. You know, when it comes to, and I'm not speaking particularly on behalf of JP Morgan here, but when it comes to the likes of JP Morgan, you're not going to stop them planning for the cliff edge, and there's nothing you can say reassuring that won't have them potentially taking out office space in other parts of Europe and all of those kind of issues. You know, that ship has sailed, because we absolutely have to be able to say, you know, on the first day of April or whatever it is on 2019, that we can do all the things that we're doing now for clients. So that's already gone. That's not something that you can say, look, we're going to give you an adjustment period and it'll happen. I think there's a huge swathe of business, probably much more important swathe of business for the UK, which would still could be greatly helped by an assurance now that whatever we have, whatever outcome we reach with the EU, there will then be an adjustment period. Once you reach the deal, there is then an adjustment period, and we don't get hung up about whether it's called an implementation phase or an adjustment period or a transitional period. We just give people that clarity that nothing will change for X amount of time. So that's the sort of my immediate reaction. I think just the 3 things longer term that I hope we might see as a result of this election, but also as a part of this kind of research. You know, the first thing would be that the debate will get serious and engage with details. I mean, one of the things that my partner said to me the day after the referendum was, oh God, apart from anything else, we now have to spend the next 5 years talking about this, if not 10 years. And I think we all kind of braced ourselves for, oh my God, the next year we're going to spend learning about all this incredibly boring stuff. And we're going to have to, as citizens, understand the difference between the customs union and the single market. And, you know, it's going to be this schooling session. And I thought, thank God I don't have to do that on the 10 o'clock news every night explaining this stuff. And what's been so depressing about the last year is actually an awful lot of that debate. Of course, it's happened in the wonkier corners of Britain. But, you know, one thing that came through in this study is there's been a chilling effect around a lot of those details. There has been a kind of accusation, if you point out these details, that you're a naysayer. You know, Gisela, I think, sort of referenced this a little bit. The moment, you know, don't give me your details and your difficulties, give me your plan. Well, you have to have both sides of that. So I hope, you know, at least what we will get from this is a willingness to be more serious on the details, and that wanting to talk about details won't immediately suggest that you're somehow denying the will of the people or anything else. So will we have a proper discussion around the difference between the customs union and the single market, I hope. Will we have a clear understanding of the impossibility, as Peter said, of making up in your trade with the other countries what you would reasonably lose in most scenarios outside of the customs union trading with the EU 27. If you add up the next 10 trading partners, whether it's by exports or imports as a share of GDP, it still doesn't reach the amount we trade with the EU 27. So if we're kind of clear about how important our EU trade is, you know, I think that's also a good place to start. I think we have to be clear that the Great Repeal Act is not going to be just a cut and paste job. That if we, you know, or a find and replace job, find the word EU, replace with something else. You know, if you talk to anybody who's actually engaged with what that means, yes, it could be liberating. Yes, we could get the chance to rewrite the rules and make them more enabling. And I think that is a possibility in some areas. But then you need time to do that, and you need some kind of debate and scrutiny. Because you cannot be a question where civil servants are kind of putting their fingers in the air in a back room saying, well, so if we've got the takeover panel and you're devising market size with regard to the EU economy, EU market, well, what do we say now? Do we say UK market? Do we say UK plus EU? You know, that's just one example. There are lots of examples where they'll be committing policy when they do this cut and paste. They will actually have to think about things, and that goes again to the unrealistic nature of the timetable, that you could replace that amount of legislation which involves that much thought in some key areas on such a short time frame. And it's certainly the thing that has most concerned many in Whitehall, just the practicality of doing that, even before we found out we were going to have a minority government trying to pass those things. I think finally on just the details thing, I think I would say we need to understand that reverting, and I think people are beginning to understand this, that reverting to WTO rules is actually not a thing. You know, it doesn't actually exist. You know, a tiny fraction of the arrangements that underpin any kind of practical trade, whether it's goods or services, that happens in the world, let alone with European Union countries, is related to a WTO rule. And it's not a sort of factory settings, you know, that you can default to. You just reboot the computer and go back to factory settings. We would have to actually recreate all of those things. Now, again, it's not that it's impossible, Gisela, and I totally get that, but it's also not something that you can just take off the shelf. It requires thought and probably time and a lot of kind of open debate. So I guess that's what, you know, my second sort of big ask would be, that's sort of obvious for me to say and is embedded in this paper, is we would hope that the voice of business and jobs, as Ed said, you know, this is also about, you know, jobs as casualties to this process if we handle it badly, that the voice of business will be heard more than it has been in the last year. It's not just the election campaign, it's the whole of the last year where it hasn't been heard. You know, I think Theresa May was wrong to make such a virtue of kicking big business out of the door, and that's, you know, I would say, actually, the likes of Jamie Dimon have still had plenty of time to get cross with her at various meetings. But I think she was certainly right to say that it couldn't be about, or at least give the impression that this couldn't be about the traditional, the usual suspects in the business community. It should be about small and medium-sized businesses. And that's why I think, again, this was completely on point, this paper. I personally thought many years ago, not many years ago, but at least 5 or 6 years ago, I would say to people outside the UK, you know what, this is now a much more thinkable possibility, leaving the EU. And one of the reasons I said that was I thought there was quite a swathe of the business community, certainly small and medium-sized community, who were now associating the single market not with liberation, but actually with red tape. And that, whether that was true or not, that was something that was not being addressed and engaged with, and now you really do have to, as part of this process, I think, engage in that. I think finally, I would like, and this is much more from an economic standpoint from anything else, and it goes to what Gisela said, some assurance that if we're going to seize the opportunities of Brexit, of this debate, and recognise some of the failings we've had in the economic model before, particularly on things like skills and education, we also have to be realistic about the price tag that comes with that and kind of face up to that. Because I think that was one of the unfortunate things when Theresa May positioned herself as the country that works for everyone and the wonderful speech on Downing Street. One expected to come with that policy, which then didn't really come with that. We just got a bit, and this is from a business standpoint, you got a lot more words about productivity and about industrial strategy and training and skills, but the amount of money that's due to be spent on training and on education for over 16s outside traditional universities and schools has continued to fall. We know what's happening to per pupil spending, both under 16 but also post 16 prospectively. I think that's something that needs more debate, because it is absolutely true. This shouldn't be the reason why we're talking about skills and education, and it should be something actually that all sides can agree on, regardless of what kind of Brexit we get. We have to focus on this stuff, and we have to recognise that it costs money, and may also involve some difficult conversations with business. But I think that if we have some kind of open and good faith conversation about any of these things as we go through this process, that would be a much better place than we were a few weeks ago even.
Okay, we've got about 15 to 20 minutes of questions. Can you please state your name and affiliation? Can you wait for the mic? Make it pithy, please. John.
Thank you. My name is John Mills, and I worked with Gisela Stuart on the Labour Leave front during the referendum. If you look at the total sales that Britain makes to the European Union, including goods and services, it's just under £250 billion a year. If you look at the total costs of our being in the European Union, you add together the trade deficit, which is about £70-odd billion, plus the income deficit, which is about another 10, plus the total amount we contribute to the EU budget, it's about £93 billion. It's about 40% of the total sales we make to the EU. Now, you can say that that's not a fair way of accounting, but the fact is that we're paying an incredibly high price to be able to sell to the European Union on the terms we are. And I've really got three questions. One, does anybody think that a ratio of 40% like this is anything like reasonable? The second is, should we really be biasing everything towards staying in the single market if it's as expensive as that? And third, if we move more and more towards a softer and softer Brexit, are we likely then to get further and further into the mire with no prospect of pulling back this enormous sum of money, which is 5% of GDP?
Anyone like to respond to that?
I'm afraid that's bizarre economics. I mean, it's not apples and pears. You're adding apples and goldfish. I don't think I mean, it's bizarre economics.
I think the one thing that John doesn't take into account is whether the underlying growth of the British economy would be stronger because of the trade which we do with our European partners, or whether it's weaker because of our trade with the European partners, or it's just zero sum. Because in that calculation, aside from the trade surplus point, it sounds a bit zero sum, whereas I think most people would think that actually there have been some gains to our productivity and our income from the kind of deepening of that trading relationship. There's also obviously rather a lot of things which benefits which we've had from our European relationship, which don't simply get monetised into that calculation.
Right, back, please.
Andrew McLeod. I wear two hats. I'm a visiting professor here at King's, but I also chair Griffin Law's Brexit Advisory Services. My question is to Stephanie. If businesses have or are already planning for the cliff edge, and we're smart enough to know that businesses are planning for the cliff edge, and then surely Germany is smart enough to know that businesses will plan for the cliff edge, why on earth would Germany and France ever allow for us to have passporting? Which comes to a point that I wonder, in the public discourse in Britain, are we not confusing our negotiating position with a likely negotiated outcome? And are we being well too optimistic in thinking what we might get away with and not realising what we might just lose? And secondly, if it's the big businesses that do go, if that were to happen, it's right to say business needs to start lobbying with government, but can we draw a distinction, please, between big and small business? Big know how to do it. Small business have no idea how to do it. And if JP Morgan, for the sake of the argument, were to pack up and move to Germany, which it could, the small dry cleaner that does the suits, the cafe that does the lunches, the cutlery company that provides the cutlery to the cafe that does the lunches, they can't move. They've lost their right to freedom of movement, and those small businesses have nowhere to look. So how do we get the small businesses more empowered in being able to lobby into government?
I mean, I guess part of the empowerment is to also have their voices heard in these kind of ways. So I think in that sense, this paper and this exercise makes a contribution to it. On your first point, I mean, I may be slightly misunderstanding you, but I think you're basically saying, why is this, are we being too realistic in our presentation of the options, and then we're going to end up with the worst scenario for services, which will be costly for everyone? I mean, I think the point about passporting, and indeed just generally the implications for financial services of the range of Brexit options that seem to be available, all of which more or less would significantly reduce access on services, at least on the basis of any existing models or potentially existing models. You know, I think that just, it's a reflection of that really, that if once you accept that you're very likely to be leaving the single market, and at least that is still, as Gisela said, that is the stated, quite clear policy of the two main parties who garnered so much of the vote last week, then quite a lot follows from that, and that's why we would make the assumption in areas where it matters that we have to make alternative arrangements, which I guess one would say, one would hope one didn't have to use, but one would sort of expect to use. But I think, you know, this is where you get into these difficult details. You look at the financial services sector, and there is no such thing as a good deal for financial services, and even passporting means entirely different things for different parts of the financial sector. Some parts, some core bits of the financial sector, and Peter can speak to this, have absolutely no need for anything particularly special, you know, because it's banking by British banks with UK clients. Doesn't need some special arrangement, and actually, depending on how you measure it, that's about half of the turnover of the financial services sector doesn't involve the EU particularly, or indeed the rest of the world. Then you have parts of financial services, like my own bit, asset management, on paper seems to already have an arrangement that would help you kind of get round the lack of passporting, because you're sort of complicated, but anyway, there is already an arrangement that it allows them to avoid that. And other parts of the financial services, potentially insurance, some of the wholesale business, some of the bits of particularly investment banking, where you have to have this backup. So, you know, the bad news is that actually, the deeper you go, the more complicated this stuff gets, and you can't even just talk about a good deal for a particular sector or arrangement. But I don't think you can base your negotiating strategy on a sort of unrealistic idea of that.
Baroness.
Thank you. It's a good report. I've nearly finished it by having received it this afternoon. I think a couple of points I just wanted to make a question. Brexit means Brexit. I was at the G30 Mansion House dinner, the group of 30 economists that the Bank of England hosts, on Friday night after the election result. I was told repeatedly by the Europeans, particularly the Germans, that Brexit meant Brexit. So there is a hardening of their position, even while there may potentially be a softening on our side. And I think that's an interesting thing. Gisela, I'm not going to delight you by speaking about global governance and the United Kingdom's role, but if I'm reappointed chair, of course I don't exist as chair for my committee at the moment, if I'm reappointed, that will be the subject of our next inquiry. So we're all to see. I think my final observation is question, if you like, to the whole panel, is that there's been a singular lack of discussion about extending the actual negotiating period. And you've commented on the detail, and the detail is really important. It is possible to do, because there was an unreported Court of Justice ruling just 2 weeks ago, roughly, about how this will be a mixed agreement. And that means that now little regional parliaments don't get involved. 27 member states just agree to give a 1-year extension. The only problem was the European elections. But there is a compromise position there, because they're adjusting their weight in terms of the number of MPs they send. And that compromise is that the UK doesn't have elections in 2019 for the European Parliament, but we fill our quota, 62, whatever it is, with what used to be pre-1979, which is nominations from the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And the government needs to think about that 1 year, because that 1 year, in my opinion, will be critical in getting the detail right. So it doesn't have to be 1st April 2019, it could be 1st April 2020.
Any comments? No, move on. Please.
Can I,
Please.
I'm probably one of the very few people who's had the joy of spending 15 months in a room with Michel Barnier, and 24 at that stage, not 27, negotiating both across Whitehall and the European Union. And I would just like to make 3 observations. One is, whilst we talk about laws and rules, they're actually not laws and rules of physics like gravity. They are amazingly changeable, and usually within about 72 hours of the deadline. Or in the case of negotiating Turkey's accession, we even sort of say, we'd reach a deal by midnight, but we operate to London time, so we've just gained another hour. So the second thing is Article 50 actually started life as an expulsion clause. Whoever does not ratify the constitution will be asked to leave within 2 years. So everybody always knew it was an artificial figure. So, and the ECJ, a third observation, whenever the ECJ runs into trouble with the German Constitutional Court, it backs off. Have you noticed? It's kind of... So what that means is that if you go in, I think we need to go in as equals. Whatever the disaster of this election was, and by the way, Stephanie, if any American says we look ridiculous, just say Trump to them, okay? Or if Belgium tells you we're ridiculous, tell them that in the last 20 years, the one time of the greatest economic growth was when they didn't have a government. So, you know, they are about to lose the second largest contributor to the thing. So it is in both sides' interest to reach that broad brush agreement of where we go from here. And they will do if there's a willingness. And it may be seen as terribly bad form to recommend someone else's publication, but it's a book which was published some time ago. Paul Lever, who was our ambassador in Berlin at the time when the UK was probably at its most European. Tony Blair was the Prime Minister. He's just published a book on Berlin rules, where essentially he says it will be a totally economic-driven negotiations. And his final paragraph is, he says, in 20 years' time, those who voted to leave will wonder what all the fuss was about, and those who voted to remain will find nothing wrong with the way the rest of the European Union is developing. So I would plead with you, don't talk about Norwegian models or Swiss models or the single market is non-negotiable. Whatever we end up with is something which we have not yet seen, because the dynamics of the second largest contributor of the world's 5th or 6th largest economy leaving will require that we come up with a model that does not yet exist. That's the challenge.
I think the counter-argument, John, is that when we talk to lots of businesses, they thought there was a very substantial difference between being in a single market arrangement, being outside the formal single market but still in the customs union, and negotiating a free trade agreement which kept the customs union or pushed us outside of it, moving to something which was much more distant in terms of any UK say over regulatory or trade policy, WTO. So they absolutely saw there being a lot of difference in these different models. And the second thing to say, which in a way picks up what we just heard, is I think there's 2 things about Europe which are really important. One thing is that you are absolutely right that in the end the law in Europe is what the Council says the law is. And if the Council says, actually we are in compliant with the Stability and Growth Pact after all, even though our deficits are bigger, then you are. And simultaneously, if in the 23rd month the Council declares the 24th month of the Article 50 period is actually going to take 2 years, then it will take 2 years, and that's what it will say. But the second thing is, in the Council, and Britain has proved this, John Major, Margaret Thatcher before him, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, have proved that if people think around the Council table, fundamentally, you believe in what Europe is trying to do and are trying to support its development, then they're actually willing to cut countries who can't go along with that direction a lot of slack. And that's why we ended up with an opt-out from the Maastricht Treaty. That's why we ended up ditching the withholding tax at the beginning of the Labour government, very many different examples. But if in the end you play domestic party politics by caricaturing Europe, as happened at the beginning of our general election campaign, they don't forgive you for that. And so hard Brexit is hard Brexit, or Brexit is Brexit from Germany, is actually a sign of affront at what was done in the scare part of the general election at the beginning of the campaign. And this will only get back on track for whatever the outcome is if the new government or the new leadership persuades our European partners that even if we're leaving in a way which is actually not only for the best interests of Britain, but also of Europe, and we want to leave in a way which works for all. And we're quite a long way from that at the moment. But that's a thing which would have to change if you were to get a good deal rather than a bad deal.
I just want to make a comment as somebody who spent my career in business, not as a politician or as an academic. And I would start by saying that as a business person, when a politician comes at you and says, "Don't worry, I have a simple solution to this," you run a mile. It almost invariably means they're going to completely screw you up. Because what
it's
they're
a bit
going
like somebody from a bank saying, "Don't worry, our balance sheet is fine, and we'll be all right."
Exactly. No,
don't worry about us. The others are the problem. There's no problems in RBS.
This is not to say banks in particular don't have problems, but actually simplistic regulation of banking was part of the problem. And actually more complicated regulation of banking has its downsides, but actually is inevitable and necessary. And indeed, if you want to complain about financial services regulation in the EU, the largest single influence by far on financial services regulation in the EU is the UK. So we can't really blame them for the stuff that we have faced. But the main point I want to make is I'm afraid I disagree on this idea that, ignore the complexity, that's self-imposed, we can all make it terribly simple. I just don't think that is the reality. If we're going to have a medicines agency improving biosimilars, I want that to be quite complicated, frankly, because I want it to actually protect us and make sure these things are safe and effective. And similarly in aviation safety and all these different areas, you don't want simplistic regulation. I completely agree with the idea that regulation should be an enabler. But the point I think we sometimes miss in the characterization of the EU as this sort of regulatory bureaucratic monolith is that the fundamental notion of the single market is that one set of regulations, even if it's imperfect, tends to be simpler than 28 sets of regulations. And that is the sort of fundamental notion of it. And when I look at some of the things coming down the road, such as the digital single market, such as PSD2, which is Payment Service Directive 2, which is actually one of the most radical enablers of fintech. It's more radical than anything happening anywhere else in the world. The characterization of these things as being sort of bureaucratic impediments to innovation, I just think is wrong. And so we need to both be critical of what's there, but we also need to be self-critical in the sense of if we're going to replace it with another set of things, we need to make sure they're actually better.
And all of the companies who involved in those sectors, even if we're outside the European Union, are desperate to be still under the purview of those individual regulatory agencies, like in pharma.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to draw that to a close, bang on time. Thank you. What a wonderful evening we've had. Do join us for a drink upstairs. It's our last event of the season. We've had quite a run. Can I pay tribute to my team who do such a sterling job behind the scenes and making these things work so smoothly. Before I go, again, a very big thank you to our sponsors, the XC and the Department of Political Economy. And all that's left for me to say is a very big thank you to Gisela, to Stephanie, to Peter, and to Ed. Thank you. Thank you.